Welcome back to Andy and Anna Talks. Today, we're diving into something unsettling, something that's been hiding in plain sight for decades.
It really is unsettling when you start looking at the history, the pattern.
Exactly. When you line up the data on major aviation incidents in India, it's hard to just call it bad luck.
Yeah.
Our deep dive into the material you've shared, it keeps pointing towards two names, doesn't it? Air India, or its group Airlines, and Boeing.
That's right. That's really the core mission here today.
Yeah.
We're trying to sift through these, articles, reports, all the source material to understand why this pattern exists, why these specific names keep coming up in connection with some of India's worst air disasters. What's the story the data actually tells us?
Okay, so let's start by just laying out that pattern, because looking at the list drawn from the sources, it's frankly chilling. It's crucial to see the scope.
It is. It's a difficult list to go through, but necessary.
Okay, starting way back, 1978, Air India Flight 855, a Boeing 747.
Right. Just plunged into the Arabian Sea right after taking off from Mumbai. 213 people lost. Gone. Just like that.
And then just 7 years later, 1985, Air India Flight 182, another 747.
Yeah, that one. That was the mid-air bombing over the Atlantic, just horrific terrorism, 329 deaths.
Yeah.
One of the deadliest aviation attacks, full stop.
Then jumping to the 90s, 1993, Indian Airlines Flight 491.
But this one wasn't a Boeing, it was an Airbus A320, but still part of the Air India group, right? Indian Airlines.
Yeah. Collided with a truck on the runway during takeoff in Aurangabad. A truck, 55 people died.
Just unbelievable. Then fast forward quite a bit to 2010, Air India Express Flight 812.
A Boeing 737 this time overshot the runway in Mangalore.
A really tragic one. 158 lives lost in that crash.
And then much more recently, 2020, Air India Express again, Flight 1544, also a Boeing 737.
Skidded off that tabletop runway in Kozhikode during the pandemic evacuations. 21 deaths there.
And the material even points further back to the older crashes on Mont Blanc, 1950 and 66, both Air India.
Right, those are Lockheed Constellations, predating the Boeing focus, but it shows a long history involving serious incidents for the airline.
And the 66 one, that's the crash that killed Homi Bhabha, the father of India's nuclear program. A huge loss.
Absolutely. So when you look at all of this, spanning decades, different planes, different causes,
The pattern is just stark.
it really is. The data just keeps showing it. Major loss of life incidents, and nearly every time there's a footnote that says Air India Group or Boeing. Sometimes, tragically, both.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel random. It feels connected somehow.
Which leads us straight into that first big question the sources grapple with. Why Air India? Or Indian Airlines? Or Air India Express? Why them so often? I mean, they're one of the oldest airlines, right? Loads of history. You'd think that translates to, well, solid experience, top-notch safety. But the pattern, it suggests something else.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it? The sources we looked at, they dig into what they describe as really deep-seated systemic issues within the organization. A legacy of, bureaucratic inefficiency, maybe mismanagement over many years, and crucially, what seems like a culture where taking risks became disturbingly normalized.
And the material suggests this wasn't just ancient history either. These problems reportedly got worse, or at least more complicated, after the 2007 merger of Air India and Indian Airlines.
Exactly. Merging two big state-run airlines like that. Huge challenges. Created new layers, integration problems. And the reports we saw cited specific repeated complaints from pilots themselves. Things like really badly managed flight schedules.
Pushing crews too hard.
Yeah, pushing them past safe limits, internal pressures maybe to cut corners on safety, leading to chronic fatigue. This wasn't just one or two pilots complaining. The sources suggest it was, a systemic thing.
Wow. There were even warnings, internal memos.
According to some accounts, yes. Memos warning management about these very safety issues, pointing out the potential for disaster if things didn't change.
So if people inside knew, if warnings were there, why didn't things get fixed? What happened?
Well, the picture painted is one where, the immediate stuff, keeping flights on time, keeping costs down, maybe took priority. It suggests an apparent focus on short-term operations, maybe maintaining an image, over the really essential and often costly work of fundamental safety upgrades and solid maintenance.
Okay, let's connect this back for the listener. Why should you, as a passenger, care about an airline's internal culture from years ago? How does that affect your flight today?
Because everything about that flight, how well the plane's maintained, how aloof the crew is, the training they've had, the procedures they follow, it all comes directly from that airline's internal system, its culture. And if the historical accounts suggest a culture where safety wasn't always, the absolute number one non-negotiable thing, well, that legacy can linger. It can impact safety today. You're not just trusting the plane, you're trusting the whole organization behind it.
Okay, now let's shift to the other name that keeps surfacing in these tragedies, Boeing.
Right, Boeing. They've obviously faced huge global scrutiny recently. You can't talk about aviation safety without mentioning the 737 AVIX crashes.
2018 and 2019. Terrible incidents. 346 people killed in total.
And the investigations there really zeroed in on that MCS software system. There was evidence suggesting Boeing might have known about potential problems with it beforehand.
Yeah, I remember that. Whistleblowers came forward, documents leaked.
Exactly. And it hasn't just stopped there. There have been ongoing concerns, U.S. Senate hearings, even in 2024, looking at continued safety questions, manufacturing quality issues. So the spotlight is still very much on them.
And yet, India keeps buying Boeing planes. Air India's huge new order, that $80 billion deal, a massive chunk of that is for Boeing aircraft.
And this is where, according to the sources, the story gets really complex. Boeing isn't just a company selling planes. They're a global aerospace giant. Deep ties to defense deals, diplomacy, massive lobbying power. In India, too.
So the decision to buy planes isn't purely technical.
It suggested that for huge state-backed airline deals, these broader geopolitical and economic factors can play a big role. It might help explain why large orders continue, even when safety concerns are being talked about globally.
Which brings us right to the core, uncomfortable question the material asks. Is this pattern Air India Group, Boeing, major crashes, just a terrible string of coincidences? Or is something more systemic being missed, maybe even ignored?
It's the crucial question, isn't it? Because after every crash, you hear the immediate explanations. Oh, it was pilot error, unexpected bad weather, a sudden technical failure. And look, those things can be factors in specific events. But when the same names keep appearing in the pattern, it makes you question if that's the whole story.
Right. The sources suggest what's often missing is accountability for the system that allowed those factors to line up tragically again and again.
Take the Kozhikode crash in 2020. The investigation found several things, right? The tricky tabletop runway, pilot fatigue was mentioned, pilot misjudgment and bad weather.
Yeah, multiple factors all coming together. But the key question the sources push is, okay, after those findings, what actually changed systemically? Did anyone high up at the DGCA, India's aviation regulator, face real consequences for potential oversight failures? Were lasting policy reforms put in place based on the lessons learned?
And the answer we get from the material is generally no. The picture painted is one of a lack of systemic accountability. It suggested the system kind of goes through the motions investigation, intense scrutiny for a bit, maybe some temporary actions, symbolic penalties, but then ultimately it just resets. The fundamental problems, the ones that allow these situations to develop, don't get fixed at the root level.
It sounds like learned helplessness almost.
The sources describe it that way, yeah. Almost like the aviation version of just offering thoughts and prayers and then going back to business as usual. It fosters this awful sense that these crashes are somehow inevitable, not preventable.
And who does that serve? Who benefits from that cycle?
Well, the sources suggest it often works out better for the corporations involved. They can point to individual mistakes or unavoidable events rather than facing scrutiny over deeper flaws in management, maintenance, or oversight.
And it definitely doesn't serve the passengers.
Emphatically not. They're the ones paying the ultimate price, sometimes with their lives.
Let's talk more about that cost, because it's obviously way beyond money, insurance, lawsuits, the cost of the plane.
Absolutely. The real cost is just immeasurable. The psychological trauma for survivors, for the families shattered by loss. And the way it eats away at public trust in something vital, something meant to connect us safely.
And you mentioned for many Indian families, flying isn't casual. It's often a big deal. Traveling for weddings, funerals, maybe emigrating, or like in Kozhikode, coming home during a crisis. So losing someone in a crash, especially one that feels linked to these systemic issues described in the sources, it's more than just a personal tragedy. The material calls it a national failure.
It really does.
You're right.
And it forces this tough question the sources raise.
Yeah.
India is a major economy, right? Fifth largest, sending rockets to the moon. We have all this capability. So why, the sources ask, do our skies sometimes still feel unsafe for the average person?
And the answer isn't just about money or tech.
No. The sources argue it's fundamentally about governance, about accountability, about priorities. Is passenger safety truly the absolute non-negotiable top priority? Or does it get balanced against commercial pressures, bureaucratic hurdles, political factors?
And a key part of that governance is The regulator, the DGCA, the Director General of Civil Aviation. What do the sources say about their role in all this?
Well, the DGCA is often described in the material as being under-resourced, which, makes it hard for them to be proactive, to really get ahead of risks, so they can end up being reactive, investigating after something terrible happens rather than consistently preventing it. And there are suggestions, too, that they might sometimes face political or corporate pressure, which could complicate their job as an independent watchdog.
And after a big crash, what's the typical response described? Is it fundamental change?
Often the sources point to things like temporary license suspensions, maybe symbolic fines, audits that get called half-hearted or don't lead to lasting change. The pattern seems to be that the deep systemic issues identified don't translate into the kind of robust, sustained regulatory reform that's needed.
You brought up pilot fatigue earlier. That specific issue seems to keep surfacing.
It really does. It's highlighted as a persistent problem, especially within the Air India group, according to some accounts we reviewed. Sources talk about pilots anonymously reporting being pushed to fly exhausted, really tight schedules, maybe poor crew management.
That's incredibly worrying.
It is. And the picture it paints for you, the passenger, sitting back there at 38,000 feet, it's unsettling. You might have a pilot who's exhausted, maybe in an older plane, operated by an airline where, according to some accounts, cost-cutting or operational pressures might sometimes compromise safety protocols. The sources basically imply, in that scenario, you're relying on luck. It's like gambling.
Okay, so this is a pretty bleak picture.
Oh, well.
But the sources don't just complain, right? They actually suggest things that need to change. What are the proposed solutions?
Yeah. Thankfully, the material does offer potential ways forward. Concrete actions. First up, truly independent crash investigation, meaning not run by the airline involved, not run by the government regulator itself. Get neutral international experts whose findings are completely insulated from domestic politics or corporate influence. Impartiality is key.
Transparency, too, I imagine.
Absolutely. Which leads to the next point. Public access to safety audits. Make those reports public. Let experts, let the public scrutinize them. Transparency saves lives in aviation.
And tackling that fatigue issue directly.
Yes. A clear ban on fatigued flying, real-time monitoring of pilot hours, proper enforcement of rest rules, no exceptions just to meet a schedule.
What about the Boeing connection? What's the suggestion there?
The sources suggest that airlines like Air India should seriously think about pausing new Boeing purchases, at least until all the safety standard questions, manufacturing quality issues that have been raised globally, are verifiably fixed to everyone's satisfaction. An unimpeachable standard.
And infrastructure, like those tabletop runways.
Massive investment needed there. Specifically, the sources argue strongly against building or even operating tabletop runways, especially in places with heavy rain or difficult weather. They're just inherently riskier.
Okay. And the final point. It sounds like it's about perspective.
It is. It's a call to stop treating passengers like statistics, like numbers on a spreadsheet, to recognize that every single crash, even one with fewer fatalities, means families are broken forever. That human cost, the sources argue, has to be the absolute driving force behind every single safety decision. Non-negotiable.
Wow. Okay, this has been a tough deep dive. Looking at this pattern, the potential issues, it's heavy stuff, but it feels really important to talk about. And, if you've lost someone in any of these crashes we mentioned, whether it was years ago or more recently, our hearts really go out to you. And if you're listening and you work in aviation pilot, ATC, maintenance, management, regulator, the pattern highlighted here is it's a stark call. Please do better.
Yeah. The next time you or any of us board a flight, anywhere, this conversation is a reminder. You're trusting so much more than just the plane's engineering or the pilot's skills. You're trusting that whole system behind it. The maintenance checks, the training, the oversight, the culture, the infrastructure, everything.
And that system, as these sources powerfully argue, needs to be held accountable rigorously, consistently, if we ever want to break these kinds of tragic patterns.
Because silence, when you see a recurring pattern of what might be preventable crashes, silence has a cost.
And in this case, tragically, that cost is measured in human lives.